guys, and welcome to episode 255 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now in this episode, I chat with Dr Patricia Zurita Ona. Patricia is director of the W.I.S.E Behaviour Therapy Centre, and I got her on especially to talk about her acronym W.I.S.E, M.O.V.E.S, which is an ACT-based approach to ERP. So in this particular episode, I talked to Patricia about what is acceptance and commitment therapy, what is exposure and response prevention therapy, and we address those two types of therapy initially because they both come into play in this episode. We talk about facing one's fears in service of what matters to them, blending ACT and ERP, her acronym W.I.S.E, M.O.V.E.S, and how she uses it with her clients, misconceptions about ACT, a values-based exposure menu, inhibitory learning theory as a way to understand how ERP works. She gives plenty of OCD theme examples and much, much more. So a wide-reaching episode. If you like ACT, I think you'll enjoy this episode. And even if you have not come across it, I think you'll find it useful. And without further ado, here is Dr. Z. On the podcast today, I have Dr. Patricia Zurita Ona. Patricia is director of W.I.S.E Behaviour Therapy Centre and host of the Playing It Safe podcast. She is the author of several books, including the ACT Workbook for Teens with OCD and her new book, Living Beyond OCD, Using Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, a workbook for adults. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you today.
It's good to have you back. And of course, we talked about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy before. Before we get into today's topic, it'd just be good for anyone that's listened to that past episode, and I'll link in the show notes to those that haven't. What's new with you since we spoke last?
Wow. Well, so much has happened this year. 2020 has brought to all of us so many surprises. I think for me on a personal level, what has been new is doing a lot of teletherapy the last couple of months, and also finalizing all the production and publishing of my upcoming book. So that has been a lot of time consuming. And as you know, I also have been working on a podcast, which is, I think, maybe like a smaller scale project for me, right? I'm just trying to create a new way for sharing research-based skills for anyone that gets stuck with fear-based reactions. So that has kept me busy while navigating through this pandemic as well, and continue seeing clients and doing the best I can to just do the things that are important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's good to keep busy. And how have you found switching to teletherapy?
That's a great question. I think I have to say that there is so many, myths about not being able to do exposure work over internet, but I don't think that has been the case in my practice. We have continued doing exposure work over Zoom calls and Skype calls with the children, teens, and adults. Certainly there is Zoom fatigue because we are in front of the screen many hours. However, I have to say that has not affected that relationship or the quality of connection that we had with clients. Now, maybe because they were already clients that we were working with and with transition. So maybe it's different if you have new clients. But I have to say that if we manage to create a schedule that it's also helpful for our energy to be in front of the screen, I think it's workable. We just have to prevent Zoom fatigue. But besides that, I have to say that it wasn't a disruption on the exposure work I was doing. It required that we were more creative. We have to energize so much more some of the sessions. With the kids, we have to have so many breaks, sometimes here and there. But it was really incredible to see all my clients across the board still approaching their fears.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Quite a learning. Okay, so we're going to, where are my notes gone? We're going to talk about 9 ACT skills to help handle exposures. But before we kind of address that, it'd be good to kind of explain the two parts of that. One is acceptance and commitment therapy, and the other one is exposures or exposure and response prevention therapy. So if we take the first one, how would you describe ACT for someone who's just not familiar with it?
When I think about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, I am thinking about a therapy approach that is going to invite us, all of us, to identify what matters to us, our values, to take action towards doing the things that matters with us. And when we take action towards when we take action in those situations, all our fears, worries, and unknowing thoughts come up with us. So within ACT, you learn to accept and have and handle all that uncomfortable experience that is going to happen anytime you're doing something that is important to us. So I think on that sense, ACT is going to blend a lot of mindfulness-based interventions and a lot of behavioral-based interventions together. And we teach clients usually 6 processes for them to navigate through different situations. Because of that, because by nature ACT includes some form of mindfulness, is also an exposure treatment already. So some people have referred to ACT as an exposure treatment by itself, but we still do ERP, we still do targeted exposures, we still do interobsessive exposure, situational exposure. And the way that I think of that is that when blending ACT and ERP, we invite people to face their fears, worries, obsessions, always in the service of what is important to them. So I think that is what is very unique within ACT, right? There is a difference. I'm going to face a fear because my therapist tells me to do so, because my family tells me to do so, versus I find what really drives, in which way facing this fear is going to make a difference in my life. Yeah. So I think on that way, ACT and ERP, they go beautifully together. And there are also some, I think, nuances in terms of blending both of them when you're approaching your fears.
Yeah, good point. And what came to me as you were speaking is, I can't remember who told it to me, but the idea, maybe it was you, but the idea that a traditional maybe exposure without ACT might be like, you know, touch a hand, if it's contamination wise, touch a hand on the toilet seat, and maybe then you touch that hand on your head or on your clothes or whatever to contaminate yourself. Or, you know, to an extreme, maybe put your hand in the toilet, you know, it's one I've heard before. But at what point in your life are you actually going to do that? You know, most people, even when they clean their toilets, they use what we call marigolds in this country. I don't know if that's the same thing in America, but the yellow gloves. Whereas an ACT-based exposure will be picking a way of facing that contamination fear, but in a way that aligns with your values.
Yeah, thank you so much for making that comment. I think I have been training in the traditional models of doing exposure, right? I remember like 25 years ago, if my client was afraid of being a pedophile, we used to go to some clothing store of children, maybe lick our hands and then touch some of the clothes, right? Just to do evidence and just learn to just face that fear, right? The possibility that someone will find out that I'm a pedophile. I think what's different as also exposure treatment has evolved, and especially within ACT, that we invite you to face these fears in the context of your day-to-day life. So that means that, for example, if I'm afraid of being a pedophile, no human being, not just a person with a fear of being pedophile, we don't go to a store and we lick our hands and put, you know, touch a clean children's clothing, right? That's not something we do in our day-to-day basis. So the exposures within ACT start as part of the context of a person's day-to-day life. Of course, what we're going to do as the treatment progresses, we are going to create different situations to help people to have a different relationship with these fears. But the starting point is not pushing the envelope. I think the starting point is looking at in which way this fear is affecting your relationships, the relationship with yourself, your work relationships. So we look at how is that affecting your life, and then we build exposure exercises from that place in that particular context.
Yeah, thank you. Good explanation. Okay, so let's get into the 9 ACT skills to help handle exposures. So do you want to kind of start with the first one?
Yeah, maybe I can give a little bit of a preview where this is coming from.
Yeah, please.
I think your audience may be familiar with so many books on ACT, the Happiness Trap, the Reality Slap, the ACT Workbook. And what we have these days, I don't know, there may be more than 50, 70 books on ACT. And all of them are very interesting, and they cover all the skills, all the processes that we call it within ACT, right? The self as a context, contact with the present moment, the fusion. But one of the challenges I encounter in my work is how we can make ACT skills more accessible to the client that comes into my office, to the client that is dealing with an existential obsession or fears of contamination. And I think that as much as I love ACT, the way that we deliver ACT also needs to be more accessible for our clients. So given that, right, what I did, I spent, I think, a lot of time trying different ways to make these skills accessible. And it was very helpful to get the input from my clients in terms of what works for them and what doesn't, because they always had questions, right? I hear questions like, okay, I know I'm trying to have a space between me and my thoughts, right? But how does it relate to my fears? So I think, I know for me, I can speak in my case, when learning ACT hundreds of years ago and then applying into that room with my clients, it didn't come from one day to another day, and reading one book wasn't enough. I think there is a process also in which we are learning to deliver the skills. And what I found is I found a way to, I think, make those skills accessible for my clients in a way that they can practice them when they're approaching their fears in the therapy room and also outside of the therapy room. So these 9 skills are coming from that work, just really trying to make ACT and ERP skills together more accessible for any person dealing with any types of obsessions.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And are these going to be in your new book?
Yes, I have a full chapter on that. And I think it's maybe one of the most important chapters, right? So here's if I can say a little bit more about this. Yeah. When we think about OCD in particular, we do know that exposure is the frontline treatment. And I think we all have been trained on that model. We know it works. But also with time, the research on exposure has shown that we have some high rates of dropouts and people that discontinue treatment. If you look at the research and the numbers on research settings versus outpatient settings, my take is that even though we have done great with exposure, we need to do better. And I think that one size doesn't fit all. So I think ACT and ERP could be this other way in which we can help our clients. Yeah. What I did in the book, I think that sometimes, and I know this for myself again, as being training, I think the traditional models of exposure, then shifting gears, I think that sometimes we don't see or we don't pause to see the belief systems that our clients have developed around obsessions, around fear, and around anxieties. So in the book and in my work with clients, there is this huge section on looking at ruling thoughts. And if you step back a little bit, we know that what maintains OCD are compulsions and an avoidance. We're very clear of that. And that's what exposure does. It helps a person to face that obsession. But what happens, what I found in my work is that my clients have also other belief systems about how they're supposed to relate to fear, how they're supposed to relate to thinking. You will hear things like, because I think so, it makes me so. Or you will hear things like, I won't be able to handle it. So I think what I have done in the book and also again in my work, we catch those ruling thoughts and we look at how they work in a person's life. And the reason why this is important is because I think there is a huge difference when a person comes into therapy. They know that exposure is the frontline treatment, and we move quickly into that. I think that within ACT, at least that the way that I like to practice, it's all about creating this context of change, really stepping back a little bit and discussing with clients why in the world we're going to do this hard work of facing our fears. How are people relating to their anxieties? How are people relating to their thinking? What I have found is that when we help people to catch those ruling thoughts and then look at how they work in the context of their life, I think you have so much more engagement on the exposure-based treatment. So while I have these 9 skills that I'm going to share with you, I also think it's important to contextualize them, that they're part of creating this context of change, so we don't jump quickly into them. Does it make sense?
It does, yeah. Yeah, thank you for setting that up.
I think many times, especially when we are getting familiar with ACT, right? There are so many experiential exercises and so many metaphors, and it's super cool, right? But what happens when we use a metaphor as a technique without creating a context of change? Or the same with exposure, right? What happens when we do an exposure without creating a context of change? So I think that's what it's important to keep in mind. Yeah. In terms of the 9 skills, right, the whole book has this metaphor about shifting from reactive moves into wise moves. Reactive moves are the compulsions and avoiding behaviors and reassurance-seeking behaviors that most people will do, right? And the WISE moves is the acronym for these skills. Are you ready for them?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, let's go for them. So the W.I.S. stands for watching your mind. One of the things that happens is that we have been told that every single thing that we think it's real, it's a fact, right? So I think it's important to practice and experience what means looking at your thoughts, watching what your mind is doing. And we do a couple of experiential exercises with that, right? So for example, we will do things like visualizing obsessions or objects that are moving or clouds on the sky. And there are so many exercises. But the main thing here is to check when you are getting triggered, when you're facing exposure, are you watching your mind for what it is, like a content generating that is coming with a lot of thoughts or images, or you're being consumed by them? The next skill is inviting your obsessions. I think it makes a huge difference when we look at our mind as our enemy, right? Like our enemy is a dictator, when in reality, our mind is actually overworking. It's a device that it's overworked and it's trying to protect us. So if someone is working super hard to protect me, will I be mean and will I call them the dictator? I wouldn't. But also what happens is that when you stop perceiving your mind as a threat, you can actually get more access to soothing areas in your brain that will help you to make a decision. Think about it. When we are on edge, what type of decisions we're going to make? When I'm mellow yellow, what type of decisions I'm going to make, right? So the idea of inviting the obsessions is another skill to learn to just notice the obsession, name the obsession is there, and catch if you are judging it or criticizing yourself for having them, or if you're hating it, right? You don't have to love it, but do we have to be mean with our overworking brain? The third skill will be really staying with your experience. As you know, in exposure, there is a lot of sit with it, right? Yeah. It's about approaching, leaning. So the S stands for that, staying with your experience. And staying with your experience in the exposure looks like describing what's showing up in your body. Are you noticing any physical sensation? Can you give a name to the feeling? It doesn't have to be the perfect feeling, but just a name that helps us to recognize that emotional experience, right? Like my clients may say things like, my heart is beating fast, my hands are very sweaty, right? And then we're checking all the time, how are you responding to that experience? Are you judging it? Or are you just being curious with it and continue to describe it? The next skill is remembering that you have a choice to make. And the choice to make is either towards your values or away from your values. Now, why this is important, especially in the case of OCD, because I think it has so many layers. Like if a person is doing mental compulsions, for example, like figuring things out, replaying past scenarios, it feels like the obsession and the compulsion are this one single thing, right? We forget that the first obsession, the first thought is on the house, and the rest that we have to discontinue. So I think that it's helpful in the exposure to build this capacity to choose how I want to relate to that, and knowing that this is in the back of my mind. How do I want to relate to that urge? I have to scan my body, right, to check what I'm feeling. I am not saying it's easy. I think it's actually hard work. But we have to start somewhere building this sense of this capacity to choose. So that basically the E stands for either away or towards your values. The other thing I would like to add is that in my humble experience, my clients, every one of them, from the 7-year-old to the person in mid-20s, person in mid-50s, they are doing the best they can to handle these obsessions. And sometimes they do a compulsion. I think what I have witnessed with my clients is that when they do a compulsion, they go into, oh my gosh, I mess up all of this. I'm not getting better, right? Actually, I'm not working so hard. And I hear more punitive thoughts. I think it's important to normalize that facing our fears is not a perfect process. It's a process that we commit to. So remember that when I have a choice, sometimes I may choose the most effective response, sometimes I may not, but it's not a reflection of who I am as a human being. So I think I try to build that skill in the context of doing exposures. And then the M starts for making a choice, right? After you remember that you have a choice, what do you choose? And I will invite my clients to ask questions like, if I face this fear, what is that in the service of? In which way facing this fear is going to help me to be the person I have to be, I want to be? And then the O from the M.O.V.E.S stands for observe what comes with a choice. Again, I think it's important to remember that every single person facing their fears, they are doing the best we can. And we have to invite people to simply watch what happens when when you choose something, whether that's facing your fears or facing an obsession versus quickly criticizing yourself or feeling discouraged because you didn't make the right choice. Observing it's about describing, okay, actually, it's still, my hands are still a little bit sweaty or my heart is beating fast, right? Valuing your choice is really about giving yourself a pat on the back because you just did something super, super hard. It may look like nothing to others, but I know that for my clients, it's a really hard work what they are doing. And then the E stands for engage with what's next in life. So here's other observation I had in my work with clients many times, right? Either, after the exposure, they were going home and sometimes still ruminating or replaying how the exposure went, right? And if, for whatever reason, let's say that the exposure may not have been ideal for them, there was a lot of post-processing and ruminating over and over. But life doesn't happen in our heads. Life happens outside, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, remember that after I have done this hard work of facing my fear, what's next? There is always life in front of us. And life can be in the form of me watching a movie or holding my partner's hand or reading a book, but we have to move on because life is not about staying, torturing ourselves many times. And all these are skills, right? In the context of exposure. And the last one is softening up with self-compassion. Again, I think that hundreds of times I have witnessed how if something didn't go as ideal on the exposure, or there was a relapse, there is a lot of self-criticizing and harsh thoughts that my clients were engaging in. And when I think about self-compassion, I'm thinking about the relationship with ourselves. How can we be kind with ourselves in this moment of a struggle? So I usually ask my clients, right, to coach themselves to ask that question. How can I be kind with myself in this moment in which things are hard? Should I go on with this blah, blah, blah thought, right? Or should I just move on? What is the kindest thing I can do for myself? So the W.I.S.E moves on a nutshell is how we're approaching exposures. And if you look at them, those are micro processes, micro skills that invite a person to figure out how to handle their fears in the context of the session and also outside of session.
No, thank you. It makes sense. So W.I.S.E moves. And you shared with me a document before. Am I okay to share that again? That kind of has it written down?
Yes, I'm happy to share. I have a handout with all, what they mean.
Okay,
what cool. I would invite people is to, in my humble opinion, again, I think it's important to develop a new relationship with our mind and a new relationship with our fears. Yeah. It's like we have to break up the old relationship we have and we have to learn to date our mind. And once you learn to do that, I think practicing these skills are going to make the exposure so much more manageable.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry I went too fast on each one of them, right? But I hope
No, it was good. But
yeah?
I know some people like it written down. So it's also something you can print out and have in front of you if people have found it useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in my work, basically I don't talk about the ACT processes, right? I don't talk about the hexaflex. I don't talk about contact with the present moment, but I do talk about how first we have developed, all of us, these ruling thoughts. Because I think so, it makes me so. Because I have a repetitive thought, it means that it's important. Or because I have a lot of this thought, maybe there is a hidden intention, or maybe I don't even know myself, right? So after capturing these ruling thoughts, that's the context of change. Then we introduce the W.I.S.E moves. We develop a values-based exposure menu. We map the OCD triggers, and we introduce the W.I.S.E moves. And in the W.I.S.E moves, I think what is super, super neat, what I have witnessed is that at the one level, it anchors the exposure in name of the person's values. We do this in the service of being the person we want to be, but also gives them these micro skills to check, okay, am I judging this thought? Am I judging the obsession? Am I staying with my experience, right? Am I making a choice here, or is the obsession deciding for me, right?
Yeah.
So I think I have found it very helpful in terms of blending together ACT and ERP for facing any OCD episode.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's different, right? It's different. I think most of the ACT books, they're going to have the 6 components of the hexaflex.
Yes, yeah.
And that's super cool, right? But I do think that in my work, clients always ask for something that was more relatable to what they are going through. So I think that W.I.S.E move taps into these micro skills that they can use in the session and in their life.
I agree. I think the hexaflex, and maybe we're confusing some people even by talking about it, but like I think it's not easily understandable sometimes. I think it's a good way of training therapists on how to use ACT as a basic starting point. But I don't think it's necessarily, I'll say, user-friendly, client-friendly, patient-friendly. So I think something like this, an acronym that they can easily see, remember, and it's spelled out, is something I would find useful. So.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's the challenge many times with ACT, right? It's such a powerful model. It's such a powerful model, and the research has supported it for years, right? But I think, to me, really the question was coming from my clients. Okay, how do I relate this, right? How do I put into practice what we're working in the session? So the W.I.S.E moves came from that. And I also think makes a huge difference, again, when we invite people and we help people to build this capacity to choose how to relate to internal experiences. I think we forget many times that we can choose how to do it. Nobody's fault. Some overwhelming, some obsessions are extremely overwhelming. But at some point, I think in exposure work, it's important to build that capacity and to remember how it feels choosing. And choosing doesn't mean that we're going to choose always the most effective and perfect decision. Choosing means that I am committing to a step back and watch, what am I going to do in this moment? So in my work, I am more invested in my clients choosing than them making the perfect choice.
Okay, yeah, well, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, I think the other thing that maybe you and I were touching base briefly is about, I think sometimes there is some misconceptions within ACT about what acceptance is and what is not, right?
Yeah.
And I think that makes totally sense, right? I know for me, when I am supervising my students or when I'm teaching, I hear a lot that ACT is all about telling people to accept your feelings. And reality is that I know for myself, if I go to any therapist and that's the first thing I hear, of course it will be a turn off, right? I'm like, what does it mean, right? So I think what is very important to remember within ACT is that when we're talking about acceptance, we are inviting people to make an active choice. But there is a context of change that we are creating before saying something like that. So it's not a prescription, right? Sit with this, face it. I think it's about creating the context of change and helping people to notice the difference between holding on to something with white knuckles, like I'm doing right now with my fist, versus notice how it feels when I'm relaxing my hands, right? So I think there is a lot of experiential exercises and moments that we create for people to experience that. But again, I think that if a person read a book and I have seen this with my students, right? I think it's easy that sometimes we all could misconstruct some of these ideas.
Yeah, I agree. And another one that I've seen before, and I've had messages around this idea of acceptance in ACT, especially around thoughts. And it's like, does acceptance mean I have to accept that the thoughts are true, or that the thoughts might be true? And I'm like, God, no, that's definitely not what you know, because you don't want to accept that the thoughts are true if they're taboo and horrible. It's more, and quote me if I'm wrong, around accepting that the thoughts are there. So not the content, but the existence that they're in your mind, whether they're real or not is irrelevant. You're accepting that they're just there.
Yeah, I think, to me, thank you so much for sharing that, because again, I think if we throw ACT as a technique, we're missing the boat. But I think, most ACT therapists, right, at least I think when people have more training, we're creating the context of change in which we have to help people to notice a thought for what it is, letters and words put together, and not for our mind tell us it is, right? Yeah. So again, to me in my work, that's why I think looking at the ruling thoughts at the beginning is important, right? Because I think so, it makes me so, right? If I have this thought a lot means something about me. Most of my clients, if not all of them, they have developed a belief systems that while may not get activated in an OCD episode, that's the way they're looking at their thinking. And that's the way they're looking at their anxieties. So I think it's important to unpack that a little bit. In fact, one of the tips, one of the dating tips I have for my clients is always look at the F of your thoughts. It's not a bad word, but it's look at the function of your thoughts, right? So after we unpack all these ruling thoughts, we have new tips to develop a new relationship with our mind. And that's how I built mindfulness. But I also talk about this other skill about always look at the F of thinking, look at the function of thinking. So imagine that if I jump into an exposure using ACT without creating the context of change, it could be hard, right? Yeah. So I think some of these key ideas and key skills are very powerful, but we cannot use them as techniques. I think we have to create this context of change.
Yeah, I like that. And it's kind of the word that comes to me is like the remembering the philosophy of this therapy versus the tools of it or the skills of it.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I notice again, for me, when I'm teaching, I see that my students have read, so many books of ACT, and they know how to use the bus metaphor or the sky metaphor. I think, to me, any person can throw a technique. It's like cooking. I can grab a recipe and just cook. But the chef mixed ingredients, try flavors, weights, right? So I think in therapy, many times, we owe it to our clients to create this context of change, in particular with ACT. So I think the process is also going to look different, right? But also the engagement that the person may have in the treatment, it can be actually, I think, so much more powerful for them.
Yeah, I agree. And let's go back to W.I.S.E for a second. With that, in your, obviously, if there'll be that printout on the website, if people get the book, it'll be there too. But with you in your sessions with clients, how you're taking them through this, I assume, and then is it something you're checking in every session on, or is it more, how structured are you with it, or is it just a one-off? Is it every session? Do you encourage them to kind of memorize the structure, or? Yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think because they're micro skills that are embedded in the exposure, we use them every single session, every single exposure. Every time my clients, so imagine if you are my client, you will come to my office, I will hand you your values-based exposure menu. You will look at all those values-based exercises that we came up with, and you will choose what you want to face in that session. And we will talk about how you will face that, for how long you will face that obsession, how you're going to do it. So it's a very collaborative process. And then when you are facing the obsession, let's say that we're doing an imaginal exposure or we're doing interoceptive exposure, right? When you're facing that, I am going to ask for your permission to check how you're handling that fear, to check how you're handling that obsession, which means I am going to ask questions about, okay, what is your mind doing? What show up in your mind? Okay, how are you doing with that thought right now? Is there any urge to do a compulsion? So the exposure looks more chatty if you look from the outside, right? Because we're prompting. And here is something important, because many times I see the fear in my clients' eyes. And in those moments I check, okay, so what do we do with this thought? What do we do with this obsession? What is your mind telling you right now? Well, it should tell me that I should drop touching this doorknob, or shall I stop holding this image, right? So then I ask, right, if you do that, will that be helpful in your life? If we do that, who is dictating this choice? So there are different questions that I ask to help my clients to build, again, these micro steps. And I will use the language, are we watching the mind? We're being consumed by the mind. Are we inviting the obsession? Or are we judging the obsession? So why I do think that prompting is very important, because we're inviting people to step back and to look at their internal experience. So I don't think it's a robotic process, but I do think that in every single exposure session, when I'm asking about these 8, 9 micro skills, we're helping people to generalize them. So it becomes, they get more familiar with these micro processes they can go through when they're approaching a fear. So I think that, I don't know if I answer your question, that's how it looks like.
It sounds like you're the one guiding them and kind of prompting them through these 9 skills. But I guess indirectly, they over time, they're kind of instinctually pick it up, and it will become part of their own process when they leave therapy.
Yeah, I think, and at the end of the exposure session, we save maybe 15, 20 minutes to actually look at how we deal with these skills, with these micro skills. We have a reflective form about how do we handle these WISE moves. And it's really neat when my clients say, well, I don't think I was watching my mind this time. I was just, looking at everything from my thoughts, right? What I can tell you that has been really, really neat is that the micro skills help people to face their fears outside of the therapy room. So becomes something that becomes a skill for them to step back and develop more awareness, which to me is the whole purpose, right? I don't want my clients leaving my therapy room and remembering the hexaplex, right? That's not very helpful. It sounds cool, but it's not very helpful. But I would love, and I have witnessed this, that when they leave the room, they know they can choose. They know they're working and watching their mind. They know that they can stay with their experience to the best they can. And they know that they can practice some gentleness after they have made any choice. So I think I have seen how the skills are generalizable outside of the therapy room.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that came to me as you started talking before, you mentioned the values-based menu. And I think it'd be good to just talk about that, because not necessarily the value-based bit, because that's very much an ACT approach to ERP. It's more most people are familiar, listen to this, with like a hierarchy. So an ERP hierarchy, you start off on a 1 or a 2 or a 3 out of 10 anxiety, and you work your way up to that 10 out of 10, whatever it is, but this is a menu, which sounds like they get to pick, and it's not going up a ladder. I guess, is that the case? And, why have you gone for that and not a traditional hierarchy?
That's a great question. So when I think about the research on exposure, what we have is the habituation model, in which we So we know that exposure works because we're hoping to see a reduction of anxiety in the exposure session and in the in-between exposure session. Most of us, we have been training that model, hundreds of us, right? Now you know I'm a dinosaur, of course, right? And then I think in 2013, the first paper that was published by Michelle Kraske and her research team, they are the ones that start working with clients that didn't respond well to traditional habituation model. They actually work with clients that had a relapse in dealing with their fears and their obsessions. And her model is called the inhibitory learning model. In the inhibitory learning model, what she has shown in her research with many studies is that a reduction of anxiety is not a predictor of a treatment outcome. What she has shown is that we need to have variability in terms of how people face their fears, variability in settings, right? So you can do an exposure at home, in the office, that having this hierarchical order of approaching your fears is not a requirement for exposure to work. She also shared that she also found that we have to help clients to label their affect and their emotions. We have to help clients to remove all the safety crutches they are using. So the inhibitory learning model gave us the frame that we didn't have before with the habituation model in terms of what makes an exposure work. And if I can add a little bit more about that, in her research, what she found is that when a person has a learning experience that is a threat and in which they develop a threat-based association, in the exposure treatment with exposure, you help a person to develop a new safe association. It's called the inhibitory learning model because the hope is that a new safe-based association will block the activation of the threat-based association. For example, if I am afraid of spiders, the idea is that the more exposures I do at home, in my backyard, in a park, the more that I label my affect, the more that I look at the spider without closing my eyes, all those experiences are going to block the activation of the old memory that I had looking at the spider as a threat. So what ACT does is capitalizes those findings from the inhibitory learning model, but ACT also has by nature, again, it is an exposure model. At the core of ACT, it's all about inviting clients to face their internal experience instead of running away from that. And that's exposure, right? So given all the research that has been evolving on exposure, that is why these days I don't do an exposure hierarchy. I have trained on that. I have used it for hundreds of years, but the last couple of years, I have switched to develop more this values-based exposure menu. And people can call it all types of things, but the idea is that you want to create a roadmap that is flexible and not written on a stone, right? So I think a values-based exposure menu give us that roadmap, give us that frame to always invite clients to choose how they're going to face, for how long they're going to face it, how they're going to do it, what they are going to do, which is very different with a, I think, more structured exposure hierarchy, right? And I don't keep track of the SATs, and that's just me. I know that other ACT therapists, they will do it, and that's super cool. But for me, what I am tracking is more micro processes. How is the client relating to their thoughts? How are they relating to the yucky obsession, the yucky image, right? So I think that's what is also different.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for anyone that isn't familiar with SUDS, is obviously subjective units of distress, basically anxiety. And yeah, I guess the issue with it can be useful, I think, but one of the issues with it is, as you say, with habituation, we're looking for that number to decrease. And if that number doesn't decrease, you can then start to think, well, what am I doing wrong? Why isn't it working? I'm not getting better. That's not necessarily the truth. It just means your anxiety hasn't gone down on this one exposure.
That's right. And I think here's another variable that is important, and that I think that inhibitory learning model has maybe capitalized that as well. They are biological vulnerabilities. Some people's body has a bubble that is on edge all the time. How is for that person when they go to an exposure therapy session and the anxiety doesn't go down?
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you, as a therapist, I had sessions years ago in which I felt I was torturing my client because the stats didn't go down. I remember calling my mentor and saying, what did I do wrong? What happened? So I think we have to remember that the idea of getting better at feeling the yucky stuff is the skill that we all want to learn, but especially in exposure. And if a client has biological vulnerabilities in which the brain is bombarding information all the time, it's more important for them to learn that in order to move forward in life, it's not about having less anxiety, but it's about getting better to manage that anxiety. And that's why we do know that the frontline treatment, while this exposure, it also needs to go with some medication for some clients, because we do have to help the body to be a little bit less on edge, maybe one notch down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's what is also different if I think about how I used to do therapy in the habituation model, how I used to do hierarchies, and how these days I am more interested in having in creating this context of change. The values-based exposure menu, however people want to call them, is just a roadmap that allows my client and myself to choose how we're going to do the work. But it's never written in a stone. It's always work in progress because we keep adding exposures, right? Outside of sessions, my clients also have exposures on the fly, always in the service of their values. But what you have, I think that when people have more variability in their exposures too, I think the engagement also is higher. That's something I have witnessed in the work with clients.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's motivating because I'm not just doing this to kind of, well, I'd say get my life back because that is motivating. But I think that's such a big thing that I'm just putting my opinion here. It can almost be too grand to get our heads round. Whereas each individual exposure, if it's linked to a value, I get why I'm doing this one action. It's much more easier to keep that in mind than the bigger goal of, getting better, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, imagine when a person has aggressive obsessions, when they're afraid of stabbing another people, or they're afraid of harming their babies, right? This idea of being in the room with your baby when you're afraid of harming them, because that's going to help you to be the caring parent you want to be. It's very different than, just going, to therapy and just being told that I just have to be next to my baby. Yeah. Or if I'm afraid of driving in the freeway, I think it's very different if I'm driving, because then I will be able to visit my mother in the hospital and be the caring daughter I want to be. So I think the context of values is going to be very important. I think it's important in what we do, but also helping our clients, again, to develop this new relationship with thinking and with fears. I think that's also fundamental.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Okay, so before we move on, is there anything else on W.I.S.E moves that you wanted to talk about?
Yes. Thank you so much for asking that.
No worries.
In the context of doing the exposure, when we're using the W.I.S.E moves and I'm prompting, right? I'm asking what's showing up in your mind, where do you notice in your body? Are you inviting the obsession? Or are we pushing it away? What's the choice we're going to make? What's coming up with a choice? I often see that doubts, right? Should I keep doing this? Should I keep? So uncertainty comes in hundreds of flavors in ways in my client's life. As we know, uncertainty is a big driver across all anxiety disorders, but in particular in OCD, So within this model, because ACT is all about, and behavioral therapies, modern therapies, is all about helping people to notice the function of thoughts, right? One way to handle is by asking, when that doubtful thought comes, what is that thought pushing you to do? And what happens in your life if you do that? So why this is important? Because we have to be careful that we are not going into cause reassurance, or we're not engaging in this battle with doubtful thoughts, because we may not win. And in fact, we're never going to win against our mind, right? So within this model that it's heavy on looking at the function of thinking.
No, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Okay, now I think this has been great. Gonna switch gears a bit. And I have asked you this question, but you pick up the phone and call your 20-year-old self. What do you tell her?
Oh boy, the most difficult question. If I look at my 20-year-old self, I think today I will tell my 20-year-old self, it's going to be okay. Keep moving.
Excellent. Love it. Moving in the direction of your values. And you've got a billboard in the Bay Area. What do you want written on that billboard?
I will. These are the most difficult questions. I will say there is always an opportunity to be gentle with ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
very true, especially in 2020. Okay, so then lastly, is there anything else that you wish you could have shared today?
Well, first, I want to say thank you so much again for having me. And
Pleasure.
I'm sorry if I went maybe too fast into the W.I.S.E moves, but I will share the handout and hopefully that will clarify how it looks like. And I also cannot leave this podcast without saying congratulations on the 5 years.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the hard work you do.
Yes, it's my pleasure. And interesting conversations like this make it worthwhile. So, and yeah, thank you as always for the work you do, the books, and and just this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So there you have it. Thank you so much to you guys for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And thank you to Dr. Z for her time. And if you want to find out more about this episode and resources, you can find them at theocdstories.com. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.